Hey everyone! Today we're gonna study a very interesting opening line in the Tarrasch Defense that is called the Dubov Tarrasch, named after the very creative Russian player Daniil Dubov. Now, even if you don't play this line, what I want you to get from this video is to learn a few ideas about how to study chess openings and how deep opening preparation can get nowadays that we are armed with chess engines, and how they can allow us to play positions that might look very ugly at first sight. So first things first, we get the Tarrasch defense after the move d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, and black goes for c5. So the main point is that black allows white to force an isolated pawn after c takes d5, e takes d5, and after we trade these pawns, the pawn on d5 is going to be isolated. So here normally white goes knight to f3, and then black develops the knight to c6 and f6, and white normally tries to fianchetto the bishop in the main line, which is how we can get the Dubov Tarrasch. We can also get the Tarrasch defense in the English, for example after c4, knight to f6, knight to c3, c5, g3, e6, knight to f3 and d5. This is another way to get the Tarrasch defense. After white takes on d5, here there's the option to take with the knight, but the Tarrasch defense wants to get a pawn on d5, trying to get very good control of the center. And after d4, in these positions, if white doesn't go for d4, black will go for d4, so d4 is the most common move. And after knight to c6 and bishop to g2, we get the main position in the Tarrasch defense. The main idea is that white will castle, and then sooner or later white will take on c5, and then fight against an isolated pawn on d5. And traditionally here black would go bishop to e7, and then castle. This is playable, but the main approach that Dubov had is why not play in the most forcing way. So here the most forcing move for black is to take on d4, and after knight takes. Now here taking on d4 is not what black wants to go for. Black doesn't want to go for quick trades, because after queen takes, first of all we help white improve the queen, and now there's pressure on d5. But the main idea is to go bishop to c5, also very forcing because we develop and we attack the knight on d4. And in this position, even though it seems that white might have a lot of options, from a practical point of view, white doesn't have a lot of options. First of all, a move like e3, even though it holds the knight on d4, it looks fairly passive because we're blocking the bishop on c1. This is playable, but not critical. Moving the knight to f3, the knight on d4 is being attacked. Moving the knight to f3, where it came from, it might look natural, but on the other hand, it is blocking the bishop. And sooner or later, black will play d4. For example, black here will castle and then go d4. So this pawn, even though it is isolated, it is on the center, controlling important squares. So here black is doing perfectly fine. Defending the knight on d4 is very often an idea because the knight is very nicely placed on d4. But in this particular position, black has another quite forcing continuation, which is to go queen to b6, increasing the pressure on d4. In fact, in this position, white can already go wrong fairly quickly. For example, after knight takes e6, instead of taking the knight, black has the intermediate move, bishop takes e3. Now there's an idea to take on f2 and to take the knight. And after white takes, which is the only way to avoid losing material, black simply takes with the b pawn. Now the d5 pawn is not isolated anymore, and with this particular pawn structure, black is doing quite fine. There's also pressure on b2, so black is already having a better position here. So after queen to b6, white has to be careful. Knight to a4 has been played, which is probably again a line prepared with an engine because it seems to blunder material. After queen to b4, we give a check and we increase the pressure on white. But here white has an idea to go bishop to d2, temporarily sacrificing a piece because after e3, white is going to get the piece back. So here black's best continuation is to go queen to e5. If black tries to keep the piece, then white can attack the queen. In fact, after queen to b5, trying to defend the bishop, bishop to f1 will trap the queen on b5. But here black can simply go queen to e5, and after white takes on c5, white is not getting anything in particular here. White can even take a pawn on b2, and after white castles, white can try to claim compensation for the pawn with these two bishops, but this position is not particularly dangerous for black. So after knight takes e4 and bishop to c5, we covered a lot of alternatives for white, but if we use the same principle and try to find forcing alternatives for white, white has actually better options. One of them is to take on c6, and the other one is to go knight to b3. So knight to c6 is very forcing. On the other hand, it is changing the pawn structure, because now after b takes, Now this pawn on d5 is not isolated anymore. This is perfectly playable for white, but black has been doing fine in these lines. For example, in the game that I selected, after white castled and black castled, white went queen to c2, knight to a4 is also possible. In any case, white played knight to a4 later on after queen to c2, eyeing the bishop on c5, bishop to b6. In this Dubov Tarrasch, the main idea is to bring the bishop to b6, so this is pretty automatic. And after knight to a4, white has the idea to put pressure on the hanging pawns. But here black, who is none other than former world champion Magnus Carlsen, and by the way, if Carlsen plays this line, this should normally give us an idea that this line is fairly sound. Magnus simply defended with bishop to d7. He got a great position and even managed to outplay his opponent after white won b3, but the main point is that after white takes on b6, a very common idea, as we'll see in the Dubov Tarrasch, is to take with the pawn. We activate the rook, and now black's pawns are looking very healthy, they are connected. Or another idea to play against black's pawns is to block them with knight to c5. Even though this is possible, the minor drawback is that now there's no pressure on c6 anymore. Here black has a few options, but the most logical for black is to go bishop to g4. As we see later on, there's a recurrent idea to go rook to e8, bishop to g4, try to put pressure on e2. And here black again is doing perfectly fine. In fact, here there's even a threat. If white goes h3, black can even take on e2, because after queen takes, we can simply take on c5. So after bishop to c5, taking on c6 makes a lot of sense, definitely playable, but the most ambitious move for white, which is the main line, is to go knight to b3. Even though this is a retreating move, which normally are not very good moves, here white has a very concrete idea, which is to attack the bishop and also to attack the pawn on d5. And this line will involve a pawn sacrifice by black in pretty much every move. So here, going bishop to b4 is an option, but then after white castles, there's still pressure on d5, and if white takes, then after pawn takes, white can try to fight for an advantage with these two bishops. So Dubov's idea is to keep the bishop on b6, which is a great diagonal for the bishop, but on the other hand now, this seems to blunder a pawn on d5. So here the main move played by top players is to castle short, but we need to analyze again the most forcing way, which is to take on d5. In general, taking with the bishop, we could do it, but if we can take with the knight here, it makes more sense. The bishop on g2 is going to protect the king, and after white trades this bishop, the light squares around the king are going to be weak, so taking on d5 is a lot more natural. And here black's main idea is to go bishop to e6. Again, develop with tempo, attacking another piece. And even though white has many options, black is doing fine in this line. In fact, white has to be a bit careful. Let's evaluate some alternatives. After white takes on f6 and queen takes, black is getting a lot of development. For example, after white castles and black castles, now black is going to attack the queen on d1. Black has a lead in development. There's also pressure on the queen side, so black has a lot of compensation for the pawn here. So taking on f6, helping black develop doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe knight takes b6 looks more critical because white is taking the strong bishop on b6, but here black's idea is to take on d1, and after king takes and pawn takes. So from a very general point of view, white has two bishops and a better pawn structure because black has isolated double pawns on the b file. But these positions, as we see, are very concrete because now black has ideas to take on b3 since the pawn on a2 is pinned. So this is a position where black has a lot of compensation from the pawn, and it's even very dangerous for white to play because white's pieces are very hard to coordinate. So after taking on d5, e4 has been played, trying to support the knight, and here black played the very interesting move bishop to g4, moving a piece twice, but on the other hand we are attacking the queen. White's pieces don't coordinate very well here. If white goes f3, then this diagonal is going to be weakened, so it's going to be hard for white to castle. White tried bishop to f3, which normally makes sense to trade pieces when you're materially ahead, and after black took on f3 and white took on f3, knight takes e5 and pawn takes. We got a few trades, but after knight to e5, black has more activity, and in the game after queen to e4, supporting the pawn, black simply castled. If white takes on e5, after rook to e8, the queen is going to be pinned, so black castled, and after rook to e8, bishop to d2, black has very good compensation for the pawn from a general point of view, but even here, after the move knight to d7, queen to f3, and knight to f6, black simply got the pawn back and even managed to win the game. So after knight to b3 and bishop to b6, taking on d5 doesn't give white a lot, in fact it might even be risky. That's why white normally castles in this position, which makes a lot of sense. And now here the main idea for black is to go d4. So black is getting activity on the center, and the main challenge to this line is to go knight to a4, which might seem paradoxical, but on the other hand, white has to do something concrete, otherwise black will simply castle, go rook to e8 and put pressure on white. So knight to a4 has the idea to take this very strong bishop on b6, which black cannot really prevent, because after a move like bishop to c7, in this particular position, white could take on c6 and then go queen takes. White gets an extra pawn inviting a queen trade. This pawn on c6 is not very strong, so black doesn't really have compensation for the pawn here. So after knight to a4, black normally castles here, and here white normally goes bishop to g5. The pawn on d4 can be taken, but white normally decides to develop other pieces, so there's no hurry to take on b6, then take on c6, and then take on d4. We're going to cover these lines in just a few moves. So after bishop to g5, here I had a few games to show how black is doing quite fine in these lines. We can start with the move h6, which is quite forcing, attacking the knight, and after bishop takes and queen takes, if white doesn't do anything concrete, black will simply go rook to e8 and bishop to g4. This is the main idea for black, simply connect pieces and develop quickly. And after knight takes and pawn takes, white can get a pawn, even trading a few pieces. After bishop takes, b takes, queen takes makes a lot of sense. In fact, after knight takes d4, rook to d8 is going to pin the knight. So queen takes might look attractive because we get an extra pawn, we're trading pieces, we're also inviting the queen trade and also eyeing the pawn on b6. But here black simply played the move rook to d8, even allowing this trade, which white went for. If white takes on b6, black can go bishop to h3 or even bishop to a6. There's a lot of pressure on white's pawns. So after rook takes, queen takes, and pawn takes looks very tempting for white because white has an extra pawn. We're getting closer to an ending. And even though this position might look desperate, black has very concrete ideas to continue. After rook f to c1, black went bishop to e6, and the rook on a8 is active, the rook on d8 is also active on the d file, and there's an idea to take on b3. So here, if white takes on c6, we have this recurrent idea of taking on b3, and the pawn on a2 is pinned. Here white tried king to f1, so black can hold because this position is quite concrete. The pressure on the pawn and the knight is quite annoying. White cannot go a3 without losing the knight, and here black went rook to a4, planning to double rooks, and after king to e1, rook d to a8, rook to c3, we got a few trades, and after knight to c1, rook takes b2 and rook takes c6, black managed to draw the game quite comfortably. So after bishop to g5, h6 is quite forcing, black didn't have any particular problems there. In another game, black went rook to e8, which also makes a lot of sense, planning to put pressure on e2. That's why here white went rook to e1, anticipating this idea, and after h6, knight takes b6, black's idea is to take with the a-pawn. Even though it weakens the pawn, it's all about activity in this line, and after bishop takes, b takes, we also got a few trades. So here we get a very similar position. Black could have tried, like in the previous game, going rook to d8, inviting this queen, and even allowing the double pawns on the f-file. In general, black doesn't want to trade on d4 and help white improve the knight on b3, which in this line is a very passive piece. And even here, black played the very amazing queen to d8, defending the pawn on b6, still not being afraid of this queen trade. And here white, who is Magnus Carlsen, a very ambitious player, went queen to c3, preventing this trade. But after c5, rook a to d1, queen to e7, and knight to c1. Black's bishop is better than the knight on c1. The bishop will go to b7. Black might have ideas to attack on the light squares. Here black went h5, and after a3 and h4, black definitely has compensation for the pawn, maybe even an easier position to play. Even though black lost the game because he got overambitious, black's position is quite playable. And before I move on to the last position, if you want to seriously get better at chess besides working on your chess openings, I have a free course that will help you with that, so feel free to check the link in the description. So just to recap the main idea in the Dubov Tarrasch, after bishop to c5, putting pressure on d4, the critical try is knight to b3, and after bishop to b6, taking on d5 is quite risky, so white normally castles, and after black goes d4, knight to a4 is again the critical try for white, and after black castles, bishop to g5, h6 can be played here. As we analyzed, rook to e8 was the previous line that we covered. Rook to e1 was played in that game. White also tried taking on b6 directly, and here again black take with the a-pawn. Now that we covered this line extensively, this move looks natural to us, but generally speaking, doubling pawns looks scary. And here in this game, white tried a very interesting move. White went e3. So instead of going for bishop takes and grabbing the pawn on d4, white played the move e3, trying to trade this very important pawn. And here black has to be a bit careful. If black takes on e3, after white takes, white can try to fight for an advantage with these two bishops and a better pawn structure. That's why here black went d3, moving the pawn further. This pawn might become a target, but if it's not captured, it might also be quite a dangerous pawn. And here after white took on f6, black took with the f pawn in order to not lose the pawn on d3. And after a3, black went bishop to e6, so black's pawn structure really looks horrible, but on the other hand, black is counting on his activity and on this pawn on d3. Now that white played a3, the rook might come to c8, the knight might come to e5, so overall black got quite a comfortable position and the game ended in a draw. So this was quite a deep dive in the Dubov Tarrasch. You must definitely try it in your games if you find this line attractive. This has been played by the top players. In any case, thanks a lot for watching and I'll see you in the next video.